Okay, so to get started here, we're going to talk about percent and number equivalents. So we're going to go over like what's the difference between the two of them, how can you go back and forth between percents and what they would be as a number. We're going to first kind of focus on talking about decimals and how to get them to be percentages. So a percent would be when you're expressing a quantity in relation to a unit out of 100. So like 75% out of 100 would be talking about the whole population, and if I only looked at 75% of it. So like just on those tests that we were just looking at, you guys were able to figure out, your top number divided by your bottom number told you what your percentage was on the test, so what you got right on the test. A mixed percent would be numbers that have a whole number piece and a decimal piece. So just like we saw with fractions with a whole and a fraction piece, we can have the same thing happen with percentages. In order to write any number as a percent equivalent, you take the number times 100, and that's going to get it to move to a percentage. So a lot of times those will look like decimals, but you can also have whole numbers included in there too. So percentages can go over 100%. Most of the time when you're dealing with a percent, it's out of 100, so it's not super common for it to go over 100%, but it can happen. And you're going to want to make sure that your answer has that percent symbol. So take a couple minutes here. I want you guys to go through these first couple problems on that first page. I think there's 5 of them. I want you to write those as percentages. So take all these numbers times 100. So for this first one, you would just take it times 100. So you can also think about just moving your decimal place, and that's going to be 27%. So you guys do the last 4 there on that sheet, on that front page. Okay, so what would be 0.875 as a percent? Good. Number 3? Say that again. You could if they asked you to. Like if they wanted a whole percent, then yeah, you could round up to 88%. How about number 4? 0.4%. And number 5? Good, 200%. Now, if they give it to us as a fraction instead of a decimal, what you'll have to do, what you can do first is either write it as a decimal, or you don't have to even do the division here. What you can think of as what's happening is you're taking 67 over 100 times 100. Now you can write 100 as 100 over 1. What's going to happen if you guys actually do this though? If you multiply like this, something's going to happen right away. The hundreds are going to cancel and you're going to be left with 67 over 1, which is the same thing as just 67. So if it's written out of 100, that top number is your percentage. Now if it's not written out of 100, you can still set it up the same way that I'm doing here. So if we look at number 2 says a fourth. So it's not 1 over 100. So I'm not going to say 1%. But I can still set it up as 1/4 times 100 over 1. And then I can reduce. So how many times can 4 go into 100? 25 times. So now this would say 25 over 1, which is the same thing as 25%. If you're using a calculator to do these problems, you can divide the fraction. So you could take 1 divided by 4, you get 0.25, and then take it times 100 like we were just doing, and you would still get 25%. Okay, so I want you guys to do 3, 4, and then 5 continues on the next page. Write those as percentages. So for number 3, what would be 3.5 as a decimal? 3.5. If you take that times 100, you get 350%. If you wanted to, you could have written this as an improper fraction like we did last chapter, which would be 7 over 2, and then you can still take that times 100 over 1. So you would get like 700 over 2, which is still going to be 350, and then you just add your percentage sign to it. So you're going to get the same answer regardless of which method you guys choose to do. How about number 4? What'd you guys get for a percentage here? Good, 175%. And then how about for number 5? $22.2. It would be repeating, but 2/3 is, as a decimal, would be 0.6 repeating. Or multiple 6s there, and they keep going. So then if you write it as a percentage, it would be 66.6 repeating percent. I also would accept if you just rounded up to 67%, or if you did 66.7%, because if you're rounding the decimal. You could also be super technical if you wanted to and say 66 and 2/3%. That would be like the exact answer because that's writing it with the fraction and not the decimal. But I'm okay if you leave me the decimal because it's not uncommon to see that. All right, are we feeling okay about going from decimals, fractions to percents? So now we're going to go the other way. They're going to give you percentages and they want us to either write it as a decimal or we're going to get into writing it as a fraction. In order to write a percent as a decimal, you divide it by 100. So instead of multiplying like we've been doing, we do the opposite of multiplication, which would be division, and we divide all these numbers by that 100. You can also think of that as like multiplying by 1 over 100. It's the same thing. So when I see 37%, I'm going to take 37 divided by 100. You don't need a calculator to do that if you guys know how to move your decimal place, but you're just going to get 0.37 for that. Okay, so do numbers 2, 3, and then on the back side, go through number 7. Write down what you think those decimals should be. All right, ready to talk about these? So we're going to start by taking this one, 26.5, divided by 100. So think of that as you move the decimal place to the left 2 times. So what do we get? 0.265. What if we take 127 divided by 100? Good, 1.27. Remember, for whole numbers like that, the decimal is technically sitting after the 7. You still move it to the left twice. So 1.27. All right. How about number 4 that said 7%? 0.07 you said? Yep. Okay, now if your percentage already starts as a decimal, that doesn't change how you do this. Okay, so this one says 0.9. You're going to take 0.9 divided by 100. Okay, so it's just going to make it even smaller. What do you get? Good, 0.009. So when they give you something like the last two had fractions involved. You had 19 over 20 and then you had a third. I would suggest making the fractions decimals before you try to divide by 100. So what's 19 over 20 as a decimal? 0.95. So I would rewrite this as 2.95. Okay, and then we divide by 100. So take that decimal and go over 1, 2 spaces, fill in a 0 there. So you should have gotten 0.0295. Same thing with this 167 and a third. What's 1/3 as a decimal? 0.3 repeating. So it'd be 0.33333 forever. So if you need to, write it out a couple spaces, like 167.333. Divide that by 100. Move your decimal over 2. So you're going to get 1.673 repeating. And again, on one like that, if they tell you to round it however they tell you. If they don't specify and you want to round it to like 1.7. Okay, if you want to cut it short, that's fine. All right, now that we've taken percentages to decimals, we're going to take percentages to fractions. This is the same idea as what we were doing. We're still going to be like thinking about dividing by 100, especially if it's a whole number like this one. Like if it's 65% or 20%, 2% or something like that, you're going to go ahead and just stick that over 100 because that would get you to your decimal. You're going to want to either use a calculator to help you reduce these fractions or reduce them the long way by finding numbers that go into them. Okay, so if you guys have a calculator in front of you that can reduce fractions, I would just use that to help you along in this process. But I can take out, I think 5. So it'd be 13 over 20. Like I said, if you have a calculator, and I mean, I'm talking about a calculator that's not on your phone, because your phone's not going to reduce fractions for you. It's just going to give you a decimal. What you're going to want to do is type in 65 divided by 100 and then write it as a fraction. It'll reduce it for you. Now, if you have one like number 2 that says 1/4, so it's already a fraction, we don't want to necessarily write divided by 100 because then you're going to have a fraction on top of a fraction. So remember, if we kind of go back up here in our notes, it said up here in our rules that we can divide by 100 or multiply by 1 over 100. That's when you maybe want to use this instead. Because when we're dividing a fraction by another fraction, you have to multiply by the reciprocal. And the reciprocal of 100 would be 1 over 100. So that's where that came from. So we're going to take 1/4 times 1 over 100. What would that be? Good, 1 over 400. Okay, and on these ones I'm keeping it as a fraction because that's what they asked me to do. They want fractions for these ones. Now you could type that in a calculator. You could take 1/4 divided by 100 and then convert your decimal to a fraction. You should still get 1/400 because your calculator will know to, like, it'll be programmed to know to multiply by its reciprocal. Okay, so for number 3, 250%. If we divide that by 100, go ahead and first of all, to make yourself a little bit easier of a job here, get rid of those zeros at the end. So it's 25/10. Those are smaller numbers. What can come out of both 25 and 10? Was that half or 5? So we get 5/2 or 2.5. I'm okay if you leave it improper, but if you like mixed numbers better, give me a mixed number. I don't care. Why don't you guys try the last two, 4 and 5. Okay, for 83 1/3, 1/3 is that 0.33333 repeating again. So if you need to, because if you're multiplying by 1/100, if you're trying to divide by 100, it's just going to give you a decimal. And if you're not sure how to get it back to a fraction, what you can do is convert this 83 1/3 so that it's improper. So we would take 83 times 3 and add 1, and that would be 250 over 3. And now let's take this times 1/100. So let's try to reduce here. We could probably take 250 and 100 both divided by 50. What's 250 divided by 50? 5. So I have 5/3 times, what's 100 divided by 50? 2. So what's my final answer? 5/6. Which, if you guys take 5 divided by 6, you should get 0.83 repeating. Which, if you multiply by 100, would get you back to your 83.3 repeating as a percentage. So you guys can always check your work that way too. Like after you get your fraction, divide it out, take it times 100, and make sure you get the answer that you started with. Because that would be a good way to check your work there. Last one, how could I write 12.5 as a fraction? 25/2 because it's 12.5, which is the same thing as 25/2. Then if we multiply by 1/100, what can I reduce here? So 25 becomes 1, 100 becomes 4. So my answer would be 1/8. What is 1 divided by 8? It's up there. 0.125, and then if I take 0.125 times 100, I'm back at 12.5. So again, that's a way that you can check your work and make sure that you got the right answer, is get your fraction, divide it out, take that decimal times 100 to get back to the problem that you started with. If it doesn't match, then you did something wrong. So that's a quick way to check your work there.